Okay then, comrades. Well, good evening and welcome to our final, I suppose, content-led session. Socialism in the Age of Imperialism, the Second International, 1889 to 1914. Tonight's speaker is Ben Lewis, and Ben has written extensively on the Second International and also has translated quite a lot of the material from German. And he runs a sort of study circle on this material. And if you contact him with the email address there, I'm sure he'll put you in touch with the circle and also with some of his translations. He looks at the debates, particularly in German social democracy before 1914. So without much more ado, I'll begin the session. Ben will speak for around about 30 to 40 minutes, and then it will be the usual questions and so on. Could I ask comrades, if you want to ask a question, either to use the chat box or to use the blue hand system, and you click on participants and you'll see your name, and then you click on the blue hand, and then that means we can bring you in. Okay, so that's the introduction. I'm really looking forward to this talk. So away you go, Ben.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you also, Tina, for the invitation. I think this is my second time speaking at the LLA online events, which from my bedroom, as it were, during lockdown. First one was on the German Revolution. This is now on the Second International, Socialism in the Age of Imperialism. I suppose the first thing to say about this is that it's a huge topic, as we will see in a second. It covers 25 years of history, but those 25 years are certainly very eventful, not just in terms of the workers' movement, the way that we would look at things and working class history, but in terms of European and indeed world history. It's a period of rapid change and development. And I think I would preface my remarks on the Second International by saying that really it is impossible to understand developments within this period, certainly within Europe, without an understanding or coming to terms with the history of the Second International, as it was called. And this is a significant point because it's certainly in more recent times. I'm a Germanist, I'm a Germanist. I look at German history of this period, and it strikes me that in the recent kind of period, the decline in labor history, there is this tendency to downplay the significance of German social democracy and of the Socialist International, and as a kind of irrelevance that didn't have any significant impact or bearing on society of the time. If there's one thing I think we can hopefully take away from this today, is that this is utterly and radically false. We live in a world that actually is in some ways still shaped by the achievements, but also the failures of the Second International. So, having said that, I wanted to kind of just provide a brief overview today of where it came from, what it was about, etc. And obviously these are quite impressionistic, because not only was the Second International an enormous organization and collection of parties and working class organizations internationally, its output, its activities spanned borders, were radically diverse. So I can only really give a kind of overview of its achievements, but hopefully it gives you food for thought. And at the end, I've provided some recommended reading to look further into this. The Second International, as it's known, is basically the second because it was the successor organization to the International Working Men's Association, founded by Marx and Engels, among others. And it was founded on Bastille Day, July the 14th, 1889, centenary of the French Revolution, in Paris, with 20 countries represented by various workers' organizations and parties. Now, in contrast to the so-called First International, the International Working Men's Association, was unashamedly a Marxist, self-proclaimed Marxist revolutionary organization. That is to say, it attempted to cohere political parties and organizations that signed up to those aims. What is worth, and we'll talk about the aims in a second, what is worth noting as well is that actually there were two congresses on the same day, in the same city, in the same year, in 1889. The one was organized by the Possibilist wing, so-called, of French social democracy, which was what we would see now, I suppose, called as a reformist organization that sought to create a better lot for the workers within capitalism, and was convinced of the idea that, to all intents and purposes, there was the possibility of harmony between labor and capital within the capitalist mode of production if the workers won sufficient reforms, etc., etc. That was the Possibilist foundation. And a man you may have heard of called Friedrich Engels was quite instrumental in ensuring that the congress that took place in 1889, the Marxist version of the Second International, took place when it did, on the politics it did, with the organizations that it did. So the way I see it is that one of Engels' greatest achievements, actually, in the latter years of his life, this is just 6 years before he dies, is his work in putting together this organization. The Possibilist Congress actually doesn't last very long, and the Congress itself does last, I think, for a few days, but it then becomes obvious to these people that the forces behind them internationally are very weak and small, and actually it's the Marxist Congress that has drawn in the delegates and it's creating momentum, and it's on that day that the International is founded. It's also worth mentioning, because this becomes relevant to subsequent debates. I've talked about reformism on the one hand. We also need to remember that, and again, this is something that Engels was centrally involved in. We need to remember that anarchism, the anarchists were also excluded from the 1889 founding Congress, the Marxist Congress, on the basis that they reject political action, and that was one of the other the guidelines for the foundation of the Congress and its politics. To get a kind of better flavor of that, I think this was drafted by August Bebel as a founding declaration in Paris in 1889. It says, "The emancipation of labor and humanity cannot occur without the international action of the proletariat, organizing class-based parties, which seizes political power through the expropriation of the capitalist class and the social appropriation of the means of production." So already from the outset, we see we are not dealing here with kind of clause 4 socialism or reformism. This is an avowedly, unashamedly self-proclaimed Marxist project. It's about reforms. Second International, as we'll soon see, is very successful in achieving widespread reforms internationally, but not reformism. What happens later on, we'll return to in a second, but that's the foundation of it. That's the basis on which it was organized. The leading party behind it was obviously the German Social Democratic Party, which was still in the kind of latter days of illegality at this point, the anti-socialist laws, but was by far the biggest organization in Europe, indeed in the world, and was one of the driving forces behind it. So a very brief overview of the key congresses that shaped the International. They would meet every few years: Zurich, London, Paris, Amsterdam, Stuttgart, Copenhagen, and Basel. And it's worth pointing out here that in 1900 in Paris, there was the foundation of what was called the International Socialist Bureau. And that was to act effectively as the International's coordinating body and leadership between these congresses, because you see they're relatively spread out. And that included all sorts of people on its leadership, including Lenin at some point, Plekhanov, but also people like van der Velde and Huysmans, who were the secretaries of that organization, are far more to the right of the labor movement. Those are the main congresses, and it's worth remembering here as well, as Kevin Callahan points out in a book I'll link to at the end of this talk. These congresses shouldn't really merely be seen as, you know, your standard get together with resolutions, counter resolutions, speeches, etc. But they actually entailed huge gatherings of socialists internationally. So activists would attend, they would stay with friends, etc. And it's all part of what Kevin Callahan calls a demonstration culture, among the working classes of Europe in particular of this time, and the friendships that were forged around it. We'll see some pictures later on of the leading people involved and their interaction with each other. So it is very much a culture built around it. They would use the congresses as occasions to call big demonstrations, international demonstrations, for some of the issues that they were organizing around. So let's have a look at some of the major themes. And again, this is rather schematic and brief. There's all sorts of material that was discussed and debated and agreed upon in these congresses that is still, I think, untapped and unknown in many ways. But here are some of the major themes, debates and controversies. One was suffrage. So in countries where the working class had the vote, there was a question of extending that suffrage or making it more equal. For example, in Prussia and other German states where you had in the Tsarist Empire too, where you had elections that were weighted according to property rights. So you would have more votes if you own something, and your votes mean less if you don't, essentially is how it would break down. That also affected France, etc. So a campaign for suffrage, either the introduction thereof or the expansion thereof. Women's emancipation organizations and periodicals. To the left of the screen, you'll see Die Gleichheit, the magazine for the interests of female workers, founded by Clara Zetkin in 1891. Huge involvement and politicization of women, also around the suffrage question, but not just around that, because obviously women faced all sorts of obstacles at that time, not even just the right to vote, but even the right to organize and to get together politically was an issue. So that was a big theme of the International's work as well. There was an international women's socialist congress. There were congresses of the International Socialist Women that took place, and that was all part of a major theme of the organization of the Second International. Internationalism and solidarity, not just in a kind of moral sense of, as we saw in the founding declaration, this is part of an international struggle of the working class, but also so often in very material and concrete ways, where, for example, there would be campaigns against strike breakers being brought in, perhaps from another country, where there would be huge solidarity funds and initiatives to raise money for striking workers elsewhere. And that was a key, an enduring theme of the International, and we'll see how that pans out later on. Anti-war agitation and anti-militarism is a constant theme, certainly from the mid-1890s. The question, it wasn't just Marx and Engels, that foresaw that a global conflict and a potentially bloody conflict was looming. It was becoming common currency among the socialist movement of the time, the Socialist International, that basically that movement, that international, was the alternative to the coming war that everyone would see was around the corner. They weren't quite sure what form it would take, who would maybe aggress against whom, etc., etc. But that was a key understanding of the International, finds reflection in various debates, resolutions, etc., some of which we'll have a look at in a second. One controversy that's plagued the International in the right at the beginning of the 20th century, around 1899, 1900, is participation in capitalist governments. As we saw from the founding declaration, it was the professed aim of the International that in order for there to be socialism, the working class would need to seize political power. And a small minority, it has to be said, of French socialists around Alexandre Millerand were basically of the view, they were members of the Second International, that this could also be achieved by joining a capitalist administration in France. And indeed, that's what Alexandre Millerand does. And as a result, he's kicked out of the International. But that was a huge controversy at the turn of the century. Colonialism, another interesting one, because as I alluded to earlier, the Second International is a largely European/American affair. There are representatives from countries such as New Zealand, I think, from Japan, Argentina, and maybe a couple of other countries. But generally speaking, this is built around the expanding, growing industrial working classes of Europe and to a slightly lesser extent the USA. And the question of colonialism was, and how to respond to one's own government's colonial enterprises and endeavors, was a theme that could be seen at various congresses. Also some very strange positions taken on that, which I'll refer to later. Some seeing colonialism as some kind of civilizing mission, or at least some way of introducing modernity, capitalism, etc., from which then we could have a workers' movement and progress, so to speak. And others on the left wing of the International, but far more clearly opposed in principle to the colonial endeavors of the various capitalist powers. The mass strike is a particularly interesting debate in the early period of the International in particular, because, as I alluded to, we've got the question of the anarchists and the question of political action. And it was the case that many anarchists or syndicalist influenced groups turned the mass strike into some kind of dogma, as it were, as the kind of elixir which the working class could take hold of and thereby come to power. And that was a debate that raged on into the 1890s and also beyond that, as I'll allude to later on. Two themes I think that are worth keeping in mind here, because given what happens later to the Second International, is the two terms revolutionary social democracy and opportunism, also known as revisionism. I won't give the full history of it here, but it's certainly the case, particularly as time goes on, that there is a rise in the strength and the organizational basis of reformist or opportunist ideas that are calling into question the foundations of the organization, that the working class must seize political power in a revolution, etc., etc. And that works the way. It's a constant conflict in the International, and generally speaking, the major forces involved, the revolutionaries, are quite satisfied that the opportunist forces are being held in check, that their ideas are being defeated at congresses, etc., etc. But nonetheless, as we'll see what happens, spoiler alert, 1914, but it's nonetheless the case that the influence of opportunism does pervade the International and its decisions in a way that perhaps few people actually foresaw. We'll come back to that later on. Very briefly, the positive aspects of its legacy. Before I mention any of these things, the one striking thing is obvious. We are dealing with a movement here. It's difficult to estimate, and the history, to the extent there is history on this, differs slightly in the numbers involved. But in terms of active participants, party members, union members, etc., organized by this organization and cohered by it, we're talking about 10 to 12 million people, and a supporter base, voter base, etc., of around 50 million, which is quite incredible for, as I say, an organization that was not just about improving the lot of workers in capitalism, but actually had a vision of overcoming it. However, whatever one might say about that vision. The world we live in today is shaped by it still. International Workers' Day was the product of a resolution in 1889. International Working Women's Day, I think, agreed at the Women's Congress in 1910 in Copenhagen, and first celebrated or commemorated, as it were, in 1911. International Working Women's Day, I'm not quite sure when it became International Women's Day. That's another question. International 8-hour day campaign, which was hugely successful, one of the huge gains for the working class across the borders. And really, one of the things that strikes me about this experiment, I talk about the demonstration culture that Kevin Callahan describes in his book. But more than that, these are parties that seek to organize the class as a class with deep roots. Social organizations, welfare organizations, sporting, cultural associations. And as Zetkin put it famously in a description of the SPD, a state within a state. A body that recognized that it actually had to forge its own path in all sorts of ways, politically, economically, culturally, etc., etc., independently of the capitalist state. So socialism as a way of life and common sense. I've talked a bit about at the start, these were mass parties of socialist unity, not labourism or so-called broad parties. There is, as time goes on, a degeneration for sure, and there is a breadth of views contained within them. But these were founded, as I say, openly revolutionary organizations. What's also worth remembering is that many of the people that we look to, many of the people we study, whether you're talking about also Luxembourg, Lenin, Kautsky, Martov, the list goes on, Jaurès, Guesde, all sorts of leading figures and writers, they would have had, and they did have, their political education. I mentioned Engels at the start. They were actively involved in this movement. They shaped it for better or for worse. And many of the things that we might read when we're trying to understand socialist history will come from this period. What is to be done, revolutionary reform, etc., etc. What's also worth remembering as we kind of move towards the collapse of the Second International and the betrayal of its own principles, it's also worth recalling that while the vote for war, the Union Sacrée in France, the Burgfrieden in Germany, the kind of cooperation between the socialist parties and the war governments was a huge disaster. It's also worth remembering that many of the people then that organized against that went on to form the Third International and the Communist movement and were involved in the Russian Revolution, etc., would have also been organized within this. And indeed, instead of rubbishing the ideas of that experience, they always looked to and quoted the best of the resolutions from revolutionary social democracy, which I'll discuss in a second. What's also striking, this is a time of a globalized world, the age of imperialism, it's put in the title, rapidly developing working class. What's striking is that many of the themes that were taken up by the congresses and the resolutions that were passed are strikingly relevant to today's world. I'll pick out two very briefly. This is the Stuttgart Congress 1907 resolution on the coming war, amended by Luxembourg, Lenin, and Martov. If a war threatens to break out, it is the duty of the working class and of its parliamentary representatives in the countries involved, supported by the ISB, who I mentioned before, to exert every effort to prevent the outbreak of war by means they consider most effective, which naturally vary according to the accentuation of the class struggle and the general political situation. Should war break out nonetheless, it is their duty to intervene in favor of its speedy termination and to do all in their power to utilize the economic and political crisis caused by the war to rouse the peoples and thereby to hasten the abolition of capitalist class rule. Very nice. Still has a kind of punchy relevance today. What's also striking is for example, the question of migration and border controls. While this resolution in Stuttgart in 1907 was based on a compromise between some people, including on the British left, who wanted border controls against foreign workers, it was based on a compromise. But clearly, in this, as you can see in this resolution, it took a very principled stance on the question of migration. Just to briefly read from it, we don't seek a remedy in things like border controls, what they call here economic or political exclusionary rules, because these are fruitless and reactionary by nature. This is particularly true of a restriction on the movement and the exclusion of foreign nationalities or races. And it says, in addition, it declares that the duty of organized labor to resist the depression of living standards that often occurs in the wake of mass import of organized labor, getting people into trade unions, organizing both the workers of the country and the workers entering that country. One of the kind of annoying things from the question of understanding the Socialist International and what it was about and its marginalization, which we'll discuss in a second, is only next year, I think in May the book comes out, I'll refer to it at the end, only next year will we have in English the entirety of the resolutions passed at these various congresses, and there are very many of them on various subjects and themes. I've chosen two that are of interest and indeed relevance, but it says something that it's taken this long for this key integral period of working class history to be collated into English for us all to, for the lingua franca of the modern world, for us all to read, and that will happen next year. But having said that, this is still very much the tip of the iceberg. We still do not have much translated by way of the periodicals of the individual parties and organizations. We do not have the Congress records, etc., from the various congresses, and there's a lot more to be done on that score, which I'll talk about later. Negative aspects, clear. Nobody, I think, certainly I'm not going to say that, this was an entirely positive experience, because clearly it was one that ultimately ended in failure, and it ended in a particularly frustrating failure insofar as in 1914, the key sections of the International, their parties, decided to go their own way with their own capitalist governments, to dissolve the International, socialism only in peace, etc. And by doing so, completely renege upon or renounce the principles on which it was founded. And I say one of the core central issues that it organized around, the question of anti-war and anti-militarist agitation. I talked about the question of the International. I alluded to as well to the ISB. And in many ways, Zinoviev once called this organization a mailbox, because it was not a leading body. It didn't coordinate. It didn't have an authority that stood above and beyond that of the individual core constituents and the parties. And that is clearly a problem, especially when it comes to questions of enacting resolutions. So you have a revolutionary resolution, which is very principled, etc. How you then go about putting that into practice. That was a problem, for example, for the German SPD, in that oftentimes the revisionists, the opportunists, their resolutions were defeated. Anything that was pro-colonial was defeated at party congresses, but nonetheless, these people continued to organize, and that was clearly an issue. There's an irony of history here too. I call it the Engels irony, because Engels himself, at the outset of the Second International, when he was setting it up, was very much against close international cooperation, not as a principled judgment, but as a tactical reflection of, well, if we do that, what we're actually going to allow is too much influence to the right. The possibilists subsequently joined the Marxist International, etc. And he said he was concerned that would actually weaken the International politically. So maybe the lack of coordination at the outset came back to haunt it later on. It should be said that if you read Lenin on this question, which I have done, he is in his reports from the ISB and in his reports of the Congress resolutions and development, he is actually very enthused that over time, particularly after 1907 and 1912, that the International is taking more of a direct, internationally coordinated approach. That's worth pointing out too. The words not deeds question is related to this, as I just said, how to enact some of the policies. But on the other hand, it's also worth stressing that the International itself wasn't just a series of resolutions. It was involved in all sorts of activities on all of these planes. So often there's a kind of dichotomy set up between the Second and the Third International, which is based on a truth that I just referred to, but I think sometimes there's too much made of it insofar as the Second International is portrayed as a talking shop or whatever, and I think that's not entirely reflective of the experience. I've talked about all the kind of inspiring revolutionary figures one may look back to, who were kind of steeled in this, who cut their teeth in this organization, but we've also got quite a few labor traitors, as it were, MacDonald, Abert, you can go on, who, as a result of this this policy in 1914, then go on to do some pretty horrendous things. Famously, well, it's fine to talk about anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism when you're in opposition, but when you're in power with a Labour government or the SPD, then, sorry, you just have to do it. That was the way these people subsequently portrayed it. Having all this together, though, the positive and the negative, it is worth pointing out that for a variety of reasons, it's overwhelming the negative that has been remembered today. And what that has ensured is that, in my opinion, we have a generation of left-wing activists, not just those newer ones coming, younger comrades, etc., but people who've been around for a much longer time, including me, who are far less aware of the important the enduring and the inspirational aspects of Second International. As I say here, the outcome forgotten history. This is one of the pictures I talked about, get-togethers after a Congress. On the right is Julie Babel. To the left of her is August. You can't see him in the picture here. And Engels and Clara Zetkin and Frieda Simon get together in Zurich. The outcome of this treatment of the Second International as a result of its portrayal has been, in my opinion, that much that is healthy, much that is enduring and positive has been lost. Much material, I spoke about this earlier, remains untranslated, unavailable to most people unless you speak English and or French and other languages. It's also evident to me, having looked at this stuff for a while, is that there really is nothing, there's no nuanced or fully rounded appreciation of the Second International from a kind of revolutionary or Marxist perspective. And that is odd, given, as I say, 50 million supporters and the influence that it had. Often as well, when it comes to historical treatment of the experience of 1889 to 1914, we have teleology instead of analysis. And what I mean by that is to say, well, the Second International is viewed almost entirely through the prism of 1914, and then is kind of projected backwards. That experience is projected backwards towards 1889. Oftentimes with the rather ludicrous interpretation that basically the Second International was a kind of Labour Party type organization. It's true that the Labour Party was involved in the Second International, but if you look at the discussions about accepting it, it was on the basis that, and this is Kautsky and Lenin speaking, on the basis that the Labour Party would develop towards a revolutionary organization. It wasn't on its own terms, as it were. The key aspect, I mean, I've talked about the history of women's organization in the Second International. There's very little that exists on that. There's no kind of rounded social history of the impact that the International had on these millions of people, what it meant to their daily lives. The press, etc., readers' letters, all that kind of stuff is just locked away in German archives and French archives, etc. Very little has been done on this question. And just compare and contrast that to the excellent work, for example, that's been conducted on the Third International by comrades like Mike Tabor and John Riddell, who pretty much, as far as I can see, I read their progress report recently, they've pretty much done everything now in terms of the major congresses of the Third International of commenting. There are a few other things to come, I think, with women and youth in particular, but that's all there. We do not have that in English. There's a kind of more fundamental point as well, which is, for a variety of reasons we'll look at in a second, the whole experience of Second International Marxism. If you ever see the term Second International Marxism, it's almost always a slur and a pejorative term, a dismissal of that. And again, you've got this teleology question, which is, okay, you had this Second International. The problem was its Marxism was gradualist, fatalist, evolutionist, deterministic, crypto-opportunist. There's all sorts of words there, but the underlying premise or the underlying insinuation is that it was actually the nature of these organizations themselves that unavoidably created 1914, and I think that is very problematic, particularly as you would have to include Friedrich Engels, as some people do, as a Second International Marxist, so-called, and I think that's entirely false. You look at the people that were involved in this, some of the leading lights and figures, some of the most important revolutionary thinkers of recent times. Wer hat uns verraten? Die Sozialdemokraten, an old rhyme, who betrayed us, the Social Democrats, since 1914. Because clearly there's a point to some of these objections, which is to say, well, okay, but given that you had this organization that ended up supporting the First World War, what's the point in looking at it anyway? I've talked about the idea that we basically lose, by doing so, we cut ourselves off from a key chapter of socialist history, of mass socialist politics, education, organization. Also the resolutions, I quote here Mike Tabor, who's the guy that's put together the resolutions for this book next year. And he says, despite the unevenness in the resolutions, some of the compromises and some of the unevenness you see between them, the resolutions as a whole, with a few exceptions, were guided by the spirit of revolutionary Marxism. This is clearly something we can look to, draw on, place in its historical context, learn from, etc., etc. That's really not being done at the moment, which I think is why this talk or this event is important. Another key fact as well, which is a more broader historical point, is that while Lenin, Luxembourg, and the very best revolutionary elements of revolutionary social democracy, when they look at 1914, they declare this body a stinking corpse, they absolutely pour vitriol and polemic against these scabby actions by the International. But then they don't do as many left-wingers do today when looking back at this Second International. What they don't do is say, well, yes, actually, it's because we did this before and we had the Second International the way we did it and the politics, etc. What they do is say, look at how brilliant the Stuttgart resolution was, which I read out on war. Look at how excellent the Basel resolution was at the Extraordinary Congress in 1912. This is the kind of politics that we need to uphold and maintain against those in the International that have just chucked it out, betrayed, reneged upon, etc., etc. Another underlying point here is, and this is becoming more into focus in more recent historical scholarship, are the links, the intellectual and political links between revolutionary social democracy, the founders of the Second International, and the experience of the Russian Revolution, Bolshevism, and Lenin. Particularly true of thinkers like Kautsky and Lenin. Kautsky, somebody I've looked at in some detail, the leading thinker of the SPD, and in that sense, one of the leading thinkers of the Second International. Huge influence through his journal, Die Neue Zeit, which he edited until 1917. And he was, in many ways, the leader of the so-called center tendency, not the centrist tendency, it has to be said, the center tendency, around August Bebel, who's on the right of your picture there, right, yeah, Kautsky in the middle, and Lenin on the left. And the themes of those politics were revolutionary patience, class self-organization, majority revolution, opposition to participation in bourgeois governments, in the case of Mitterrand, as we saw. And what historiography, particularly of late, is bringing out, I think, in particular since the Lars Lee, is that Lenin very much identified positively with this tendency, and indeed continue to identify with the best parts of that tendency when the very people who were betraying it, a la Kautsky there in the middle, were giving up on it. And there's a quite nice quote from Lenin here in response to Struve. I think I've got a couple more minutes, I'll hopefully get everything in. Struve accuses Kautsky and Bebel of opportunism, and Lenin writes, when and where did I ever claim to have created any sort of special trend in international social democracy not identical with the trend of Bebel and Kautsky? So again, given these insights, given what we know, I think having a closer look at the so-called revolutionary social democracy, its output, its ideas, etc., is very much worthwhile. I'm slightly short for time, but I
don't worry about it, Ben. Take your time.
Are you sure?
Yes.
There's a few more slides. It's just this one's got a bit more meat and veg. The question of betrayal and renegacy and the renegade Kautsky, I think, is worth bringing out in terms of this Lenin-Kautsky relationship, because we have to remember, as I've alluded to, the war credits vote, the Burgfrieden, the Union Sacrée, is a betrayal of, it's a break with the ideas of the International as outlined in its various congresses, resolutions, etc. Kautsky actually urges abstention on the war credits votes for the SPD deputies, but loses out and then seeks to uphold unity with those who want war credits. And Lenin, as we all know, hammers him on this particular question, and quite rightly so. But we do have to keep in mind how Lenin is approaching that polemic and what he's doing with it. And he's basically the charge renegade. To call someone a renegade is to accuse them of reneging upon what they previously held dear. And I know I've made that point a few times today, but I think it's worth emphasizing, because it is, in my opinion, Lenin, Bolshevism, and the Russian Revolution is premised upon the very best elements of that Second International experience. And you look at left-wing communism in 1920, how well Kautsky wrote when he was a Marxist, i.e. before 1914, because it's worth remembering that Kautsky was the central figure in the political struggle in the international against opportunism, against Millerandism, against the rightists. And Lenin certainly saw him in those terms and respected him for it. That explains the shock when he stopped doing that and kind of joined them. And you may think, oh, it's kind of typical of Ben to bang on about Kautsky, but the significance of this actually is that Kautsky and by association Second International Marxism are thrown in together here as basically being essentially reformist and useless from the standpoint of revolutionary politics, and that's how this has been passed down today. There's a bit more discussed here, but I identify, I'll give a link to my book at the end of the slides. There are three main schools of thought in the 20th century in left-wing politics that lead to this marginalization: Cold War Western historiography, Eastern Bloc, and what I call the neo-Hegelian distortion of thinkers such as Kautsky. I go into that in far more detail in my book and some of the articles you can look at if you like. But my underlying point is that this for different reasons, these three schools have sought to create, consciously or otherwise, the biggest possible gulf between the experience of the Second International and its founding principles and the ideas that underlay it, and the experience of 1917. I think that's worth thinking about. There has been something of there's a Lenin rediscovered reading group there, maybe not. I'll leave it up to you to decide. There has been a small rediscovery of the Second International, its ideas, its figures, etc., a kind of desire to look at it in more detail. It's still quite limited, but I think it is nonetheless there and significant. More comrades are taking this stuff seriously. I think it's partly due to the success of Lars Thiele's Lenin Rediscovered, which basically makes these fundamental points. There's more writing about and translation of material from this experience, albeit again on a very low level at the moment. There's still a hell of a lot of work to go. And I think that the significance of the work is not then just to say, okay, look at all these wonderful things, let's go and have the Second International, let's rehabilitate, dead people or whatever. But it's by looking at it in more detail, by looking at it more closely and with an understanding of the original material in English, it allows us to draw both the positive and the negative, to look at what's historically limited or restricted or confined to its time, what is uneven, as Mike Tabor puts it, what is contradictory, and what is potentially useful for many of the questions that we still face and discuss and try and get our heads around today. From the standpoint of research, however, there are clearly enormous obstacles to this project. I mean, I speak English and German. I can read German. I can translate German into English. I don't speak French. I don't speak Italian, Spanish, etc. And there are, in academia at the moment, there's very limited appetite for this kind of stuff because, as I alluded to at the start, labor history has kind of been excised from this period to all intents and purposes. There are some small revivals, but it's difficult. And so, institutional support for this kind of huge project is still lacking. But I do think there is an increased appetite, and I think it's potentially a productive field of research for people like me and others who work on this, who have the languages or the historical expertise or just keenness to get on and look at something. On that note, just a very quick shameless plug, if I may. Kevin alluded to it at the start. I do run a Patreon project, which means that you do have to pay, unfortunately, to join in, but it does keep me kind of alive, just about, and my family, and allows me to look at these things in more detail in the absence currently of academic or institutional support for this kind of stuff. Here you have, of course, Luxembourg, Alexander Pavas, Martov, and Marklevsky on the right, Julian Marklevsky. Those are some of the people that I've been translating for the Patreon project of late. It's as I say, it's a page dedicated to the translation of many of these lost texts. There's so much to do and so much to get on with. It's very exciting. There's new material every week. I run a podcast and a monthly discussion group. So not only will you get, for example, you'd be the first of a global elite, English-speaking global elite, to read Alexander Pavas's critique of Edward Bernstein, of revisionism, but you can also discuss these texts with other comrades from across the world. And you can join and support it from just £2 per month. in a time of, global pandemic, when hopefully you've still got jobs and money, but £2 is not very much when you're not going out and having fun. That would be a great help, or it make a great Christmas present as well for a beloved comrade. Patreon.com/Marxism Translated if you want to have a bit more source material here. And yes, just to finish, some further reading in English. This is Lenin, Krupskaya, and Clara Zetkin. Those are some of the texts I would recommend. Some with more of a health warning than others. James Joel's is very anti-Marxist, standard Western historiography. Krivaku's is kind of Euro-communist. I mentioned Kevin Hallican's book is also very good. Mike Tabor's book on the resolutions of the Second International will be out next year. Lastly, Andrew Bonnell's book, also very good on the SPD, that'll be out next year. And finally, there's that, if you're interested in it too. That's the book I recently did on Kautsky with my contact details. So apologies for going slightly over time. I thought I'd be a lot shorter this time, but I ran on. So apologies for that, and I look forward to questions and discussion. Thank you, comrades.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Very interesting talk, and a great way to spend an evening discussing Parvus and Martov. Thoroughly recommended. Okay, we've got two comrades who want to come in. I think Paul Fletcher and Pauline Fraser. I've had one or two technical problems picking up on the questions, so if comrades do want to come in, please, use the blue hand and the other mechanisms. So I think the first question is from Paul Fletcher.
No, I think it's Pauline.
Oh, sorry, Pauline. My apologies, Pauline. Pauline, you need to unmute. Pauline, you're muted.
Yeah, I think she's trying.
Okay.
You got it.
Yeah, you're through now.
Sorry about that. Get rid of that thing. Right. Okay. Yeah, my question basically, and thank you very much, Ben, for that. Really stimulating. Commentary on the Second International, and it's so good to sort of be reminded of what an enormous organization it was, and what huge impact it must have had on just so many people across Europe and North America, mainly at that time. My question basically is about how today we have a plethora of solidarity organizations. So individual countries, each individual country has its own set of solidarity organizations with Palestine, with Cuba, Bolivia, Venezuela. It goes on and on and on. And I'm probably a supporter of, at least half of them. It would be so great if we could have a new international. I mean, that's my point. What do you think about the idea of a new international? I know there've been attempts at fourth internationals and so on. I don't think they've got very far, and they've been very exclusive, as from what I can gather. But something that would actually embrace, socialists from every single continent of the world, because we have activists everywhere these days, don't we? So yeah, that's my question basically. Would it be opportune at some point for us to think about developing a new international?
Ben, I'll take a couple of questions so that you can have a little bit of a rest. The next question is from Paul Fletcher.
So I just start my video here. Yeah. Can people see me? Hi. Thanks very much, Ben. It was excellent. I've just, I like to do a little bit of pre-reading before these sessions, and I was thinking about the divisions around 1904-5 and the impact of the events in Russia in 1905, which ended very violently, and how they may have influenced some of the some of the people at that Congress around that time. I suppose that's linked to the idea of Bernstein and this gradualism and electoral successors, and the development of the free trade unions being rather conservative influence in Germany. And I wondered whether that was part of the divisions that we can see in our current Labour Party, actually, that were playing out at the time. I'm just interested in your view of that, really. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Tony Greenstein, I think.
Unmute myself. Okay, can you hear me? Is that right? Yeah. Okay, I hope you can hear me. A few random thoughts. Thank you, Ben, for a very interesting.
Tony, we seem to have lost Tony. Also, Kevin seems to have gone. I'm just going to call in Steve Freeman now.
Mute myself. Here we go. Hi, Ben. All right. Thank you. Very good talk. I enjoyed that. And it also stimulates a lot of other. It says unmute myself, but I have already muted myself. Thoughts, right? Okay. So I just wanted to say something about one of the themes that you mentioned and where you ended up at the end of your talk, because you ended up showing us the book about Kautsky and republicanism, which although never got a mention in the main part of it, and I think it's still quite an important part of the story. So I wanted to throw that into the story a little bit. And you had that point early on about reform and reformism, which I thought was important. So the idea of a program, the idea of a minimum program in the Second International was a program of reforms that you could achieve, things that you could actually gain, yet it had a revolutionary implication to it. In other words, if you followed the logic, it led you in a revolutionary direction. So the big difference really between between the German and the Russian party was that the Russian party had a minimum program of getting rid of the Tsar and establishing a democratic republic, whereas the German party tended to go soft on this question and basically came up with the idea that they would try to get their reforms under the Kaiser regime. Now, Lenin picks this up in State and Revolution because he says what Engels does is he criticizes the German Social Democratic Party for dropping republicanism, which they do because they're not allowed to say it under the anti-socialist laws, but Engels is not happy with that. So he criticizes them, and Lenin in State and Revolution says it's on this one point that Engels criticizes all of the opportunism of the Second International, not just of the German party. So its reformism and its compromise in 1914 can be traced back to the fact that at the end of the day, it does a compromise with the Kaiser regime and says, we'll get these reforms within the constitution of the German state, which Lenin really hammers away. And he says, this is what opportunism is, the forgetting of the big picture and just going for these little small changes, these little small reforms that you can get. They're things that hit you at the moment. We'll do this, we'll do that. But we've lost sight of the big picture of what we need to do. And that's what opportunism is. And Lenin ends up by saying it's on the question of republicanism, which the Second International really falls down on, especially with the German party. Now, obviously, my question is that you know a lot more about that than I do. So I just want to pitch that in your direction to see how you take on that, because Lenin is very strong on that, and he says that Engels is strong on that as well.
Thanks, Steve. Tony Greenstein, can we bring you in now?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're here.
Right,
Tony.
I don't know what happened there before. The Second International was formed in what might be called the late colonial era. And it seems to me that the Achilles heel of the Socialist International and the Socialist parties was the question of colonialism and imperialism. Firstly, I ask a question. My understanding, and I don't have as illustrious an academic career as you, I simply took an MA in colonial history at Birkbeck about 20 years ago. But from what I can recollect, Marx actually also saw colonialism as having a positive benefit, in particular in relation to India, where he had quite fixed and I think probably wrong views of the timelessness of the Indian village. But he got his information really from the reports of the colonialists themselves, so it wasn't surprising if he was misinformed. But it certainly seems to me that the problem for not only social democracy but even Marxist parties as well is that they were organized in the imperialist heartland, and they inevitably were corrupted by that as a result. And we see that, of course, with the British Labour Party, which was always a party of empire and saw colonialism as having that civilizing mission. For example, we know the debates today around anti-Semitism, and I think we know that it's really about Israel, for example, and people point to the affiliation of its Jewish section, Poel Zion, in 1920, when we know, in fact, it was never a Jewish section. Most people don't know that Poel Zion had very little base amongst the Jewish working class, but it was at that time, but it was singled out precisely because it was a supporter of the settler colonialism in Palestine. It seems to me that this has corrupted social democracy throughout. It's forced an alliance, which resulted in an alliance with its own ruling class, with quite devastating consequences that we see today, with, I think, the collapse of social democracy Europe-wide. But that's maybe another discussion entirely as to what era and what epoch we are actually in. But I'd be interested for your views on that.
Ben, would you like to, thanks, Tony. Ben, would you like to come back in now and answer some of those?
I think so, yes, so I don't get too lost. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
So I think I start just with Tony to make the point. You know, I have no academic career. I'd like one, but that's by the by. We'll see what happens. You know, maybe it relates to the, as I say, the marginalization of Marxist theory that we discussed. I think inevitable corruption it goes too far in my opinion, because this is fundamentally a political question, and for me, the German SPD, while, to take that example, while it did have some very strange pro-colonial ideas, they were pretty much consistently defeated throughout its entire history, right up to 1914. And indeed, actually, if you look at people who were gung-ho for German victory in 1914 to 18, even subsequently, right? So the German SPD did not go to war. I mean, some of the extreme right wing like Parvus, etc., did, but they did not go to war on the basis of, you know, colonies and empire. It was basically on the basis of, you know, the threat of Russia taking over Germany, etc., etc. I know that's the reason they give, and there's more at play, but it was never ideologically, that was never in their heads. In Britain, the British Labour Party, I think you're closer to the truth, because that political opposition to anti-colonialism and anti-militarism did not exist. And in the same way, right? It's certainly in the Labour leaders, and the Hendersons, the MacDonalds, etc. You know, they were in that sense from a different tradition. I've been looking at the anti-militarism agitation in the SPD recently, and it's just amazing to see how many editors, etc., were arrested for pointing out the abuses in the colonies. August Bebel once famously came into the Reichstag with a whip to highlight the portrayal of the treatment of the Africans in the German colonies, right? So I think the German tradition had a strong anti-colonial tendency. On Marx and Marxism, I think you raise an interesting point. You know, it's one you see often in academia about kind of the Eurocentrism of Marxism. And one of the best things, I don't know if you've seen this book, but I would definitely recommend it. One of the best things I've read on Marx on the colonies is called Marx at the Margins by Kevin B. Anderson. And he looks at, in quite some detail, at Marx's writings on India, etc. And he notes a kind of contradictory statements at times. So on the one hand, Marx says, well, look, colonialism, insofar as it spreads capitalism, you know, that's a historical process. But on the other hand, given what the British are actually doing, it's quite right that these people are armed and kill every British soldier, in sight, basically. So there's that tension. And I think in Marx's time, at least, this relates to the periodization of colonialism you talk about. In Marx's time, at least, that's worth considering getting your head around, insofar as, what is the relationship? Is capitalism spreading across the world? How is it doing so? In our time, it's a complete nonsense and inexcusable trait. I mean, the idea that, that America is going into Iraq or went to spread capital is just complete and utter bullshit, right? So, but I think in Marx's time, it's a question he thought about in different ways. And I would recommend the book, Marx at the Margins, very, very useful discussion of Marx's on it. And I think Bernstein and others, they, as you say, they pick up on that slightly, and they see that, well, there's these savages, these people who haven't been touched by the hand of modern, industrial society, etc. Maybe we need to think about that. And certainly from today's perspective, that's a horrific position, and I would in no way defend it. But I still think it's different to people like someone like Van Cole, a Dutch socialist who actually owns some kind of plantation in a colony, right? So that's why he's very much gung ho for colonialism. So you're right that some of the revisionist stuff on colonialism did pick up on and tried to draw the authority of Marx, certainly. But I think the people like Bebel, Kautsky and others and Luxembourg were very much truer to Marx in that sense, right, and in the writings. So I think inevitable corruption is going too far. And maybe this goes on to Steve's point about the idea that I forget the exact phrase he used, so forgive me if I get this wrong, but the idea that the SPD basically got into cahoots with, or was content with the Kaiser regime as long as it could get its reforms. And I think, again, that is a highly misleading understanding, even of some of the more right-wing elements of the SPD. The question of the SPD and republicanism is an enormous one. It's something I'm doing more work on now, actually. And there are a number of factors involved. It's right that Engels, as Steve points out through Lenin, Engels publishes writes a letter to Wilhelm Liebknecht about the party's program, saying that the problem with the party program is that it doesn't openly declare its goal. So I disagree with Steve when he says that the minimum program is a kind of list of reforms which are attainable technically under the Kaiser regime, and that's fine. Because what Engels says is that there's nothing wrong with the demands. What they actually outline is precisely the democratic republic. If you look at the SPD minimum program demands, it calls for arming the people, right? What happened when the people were armed in Germany in 1918? The Kaiser didn't last very long. The Kaiser regime collapsed pretty much overnight, right? That was the program of the SPD in many ways. What happened subsequently is something else. But the minimum program was precisely not just a list of demands that could be achieved under capitalism, but the demands through which the working class would take power. What Engels is criticizing is not the demands, but he's saying that you do not state openly that these demands, their fulfillment thereof, implies the democratic republic. And Steve is right that that was illegal. There was a fear of illegality in 1891 after the party had just come out of it for over 12 years. And that's quite right. But it's not right to say that Engels, that for him, then that was the kind of, that was this incredibly foundational thing, because Engels actually says, if you need to find another formulation for it, that's fine, right? I think he says concentration of all power in the hands of the people, etc. That's what Engels suggests, because he also recognizes the problem of legality. And it's worth bearing in mind, I talked about it just now in terms of Tony and colonialism. The SPD always teetered on the brink of illegality because it was a revolutionary organization. It was clearly committed to the overthrow of the existing society. They knew that, and the Kaiser and the generals and the state bureaucracy knew that too. There were constant attempts to have it outlawed again in the 1890s, two so-called revolution bills, Umsturzvorlagen, 1895 and 1896, that failed to get through the Reichstag, and people were constantly jailed. So the other side of it is, and this is something I'm looking at now, agitation for the Republic is crucial to the development of to the decay. So the lack of agitation for the Republic is crucial to the decay of German social democracy, in my opinion, but not in the way that Steve presents it, as a kind of outgrowth of this situation in 1891. It's because of pressures of illegality and pressures from the trade unions and the party leadership that the democratic Republican aspect of agitation is gradually lost. And I'm working on something at the moment, which I won't bore comrades with the details, but looks precisely at how Kautsky, when writing his brilliant book, The Road to Power, actually bows to pressure from the party leadership to downplay those sections that call for the democratic republic. It's in the first edition, but not the second, for example. So it is important, but not in the way I think that Steve suggests, if that makes sense. I can clarify later on if Steve wants to come back or there's more questions. Paul, on 1904, 1905, Bernstein, gradualism, electoralism. I mean, all I would say with the current Labour Party, I think we're, hopefully I made that point clear as well in the presentation. The German SPD, the spirit and politics of the Second International had very little to do with the Labour Party back then, let alone the Labour Party today, right? I think we have to be clear about that, and historiography kind of fudges that question a little bit, and I think that's a mistake to do so. The 1904-1905 debates, you're quite right about what happened in Russia, and the bloody suppression of the 1905 revolution did have huge ramifications, not just for the right of the party when they were thinking about how to go forward, but also for the left. So I've part of my Marxism Translated project, I've been translating material from 1910, which is about the mass strike question, and all of it relates to what happened in Russia. So Martov, for example, writes a polemic against Lenin in German in the pages of the German Theoretical Die Neue Zeit, saying that we need to be careful about how we adopt mass strikes if we do it, etc. And so these debates do run. 1904-1905 does have a big impact on the strategy and tactics of the SPD. I would make the point that the SPD did take electoralism seriously, and it didn't just say, okay, let's have a mass strike and overthrow the government. It did stress that socialists must stand in parliament, and they must stand in parliament on a revolutionary organization and exploit parliament as much as possible in order to gain majority support for the overthrow of the Kaiserreich. Right? How that exactly would happen was debated, particularly in relation to the mass strike. But that was the fundamental point about that. So I don't think, Bernstein and gradualism. Bernstein wasn't Bernstein because he thought socialists should stand in parliament. It was the politics that they were standing on, and there were people. Coming back to Steve's point very quickly, there were people around Edward Bernstein in the Sozialistische Monatshefte, a guy called Ludwig Kessel, who actually in 1910 flirts with the idea that the SPD could become a kind of social monarchist organization. It could perhaps introduce its demands under the Kaiser, but they are in the minority of the right wing. They're not representative of the party as a whole. Pauline, on the effect, yeah, I mean, you can look, there is quite a lot of, while I've said there's not very much historiography on this stuff, there is a lot of stuff from the 1970s, most of it in German, but some has been translated, where you can look at, for example, Richard J. Evans's book on Kneipengespräche in Kaiserreich, so pub chat, I've got it here, pub chat in the Kaiserreich. It's basically the Hamburg police would go and spy on workers in pubs and listen to their political conversations and record them. And it's amazing. You talk about the impact. These are just, average people going for a pint after work or whatever. And the depth of their political knowledge, the level of their insight, it's obviously mixed, but it's very interesting to see. So yeah, the impact is huge. Just quickly on the international question, my point is that really, if you look at the Second International, it was founded on the basis of mass political parties and organizations, either in existence or coming into existence pretty quickly. To me, there cannot be, while I'm all for coordinating international work and working with comrades from across the globe, I think the overriding aim is still to establish a credible Marxist political party, and that cannot be separated from international developments. But I think that has to be still the key thing if we're going to found an international of some kind of substance. But you're right, there are so many international solidarity campaigns. They tend to be small, scattered, isolated, cut off from each other, etc. And I think in that sense, one can look back to the 1880s, the foundation of the Second International, and learn some potential lessons about how many of these small groups and organizations came together to form political parties that then blew up and had huge support within a very short period of time. I think that's it. Sorry for going on.
No, that's fine, Ben. Okay, Daniel Lazar and then Anne McShane.
You can hear me, right? just to follow up on Tony's comment, I mean, I agree that inevitable corruption is putting it a bit too strongly. But the period from 1889 to 1914 was one of dramatic improvements in working and living conditions for the working class in Europe. And those improvements were in some ways buoyed up by the inflows of income from the colonies. So whether or not this is an inevitable corruption, certainly we have to understand what happened to the Second International in that historical context. There was a period of rare prosperity, of peace in Europe, and of course 1914 ushered in a very different period. And so therefore, from a post 1914 perspective, the previous 25 years looked very different, and in some ways sort of looked like a prolonged lie, a denial of reality, the belief that this rare good luck would continue forever. And so I think that sort of explains a great deal of the post 1914 rejection of the Second International. So I'd like to know what you think of that, whether you agree with that, that is correct. And my second question, of course, involves, I must say my attention perked up when I came across the phrase Trotskyist bastardization. Would you please explain to me what you mean by that? That's it.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Anne McShane.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
So sorry, I'm on the back road in County Cork on my way home from work. Okay, so the points I wanted to make really are in relation to the relevance of the movement to us today and the manner in which we look at it. So firstly, I think it's really important that we do take a fresh look at the Second International, because as Ben says, there's so much about it we don't know. But that first look is a critical look, and that, we're not about trying to say, oh, everything, that, when you said there were reformers, no, in fact, they were all revolutionaries, because we know that there were many problems within it, as well as many important successes, and that we don't know so much about. And I think it's important that we look at it in that way in order to try to understand our movement as a whole, and understand the different periods of development of our movement and the various challenges it has encountered. And in Germany, I think, the development of labour bureaucracy, etc., that those questions are important. In terms of our attitudes to the international being, more or less a negative one, as Ben has said, and kind of premised on, all you really need to know is about what happened in 1914. I think myself, been somebody who's partly guilty of that because of my own research, I think that we can attribute some blame, if you want to put it like that, to the Bolsheviks themselves, because of the battle, obviously, that they waged against the politics of the Second International and the Germans from 1914 until 1917 and afterwards. And the fact that in my own research, I see it again and again, and mine is on the women's question in the Soviet Union, they continuously say, Ben, that, the Women's Secretariat of the Second International was more or less a talking shop. It didn't really do anything. We, on the other hand, they talk about themselves. We are, going to take action to implement our program to the best of our ability. So I think I'm sure undoubtedly you are right that this is not true. And undoubtedly you're right that there's a lot more to look at there in terms of the Secretariat, and certainly in terms of Zetkin's work. She must be easily one of the most outstanding figures of the movement because of her range of interests and her leadership on so many questions in terms of the struggle against fascism, and of course the woman question. And also because what I think is interesting, and what I think that you hopefully will start to do some work on it, and maybe some other German speakers, not hinting, but hinting, is to look at the journal Gleichheit, because Gleichheit was not just about the woman question. It was an oppositional journal in, I believe, the period before or certainly after 1914. But what it was and what it represents to me is that it was a working class women's movement, and it showed that our movement, which was not a women's movement, was not a feminist movement, but was integrated with all the difficulties that came with it into the communist movement as a whole. So I think that that's, you know, extremely exciting, and I live there. Thanks.
Thanks, Anne. I'm going to usurp my chair's position for a second and ask a question, Ben. You've talked about the interest, the lack of interest, or maybe the growing interest of scholars and of course of activists in this material. I just wondered if you could talk about the contemporary debates. I mean, I've picked up on some debates in the United States on the Second International, and particularly on Kautsky. I must confess I've not really picked up on the same thing in Britain, or indeed in the English language. So I'd perhaps like you to comment on those, and maybe does that point towards you know, revived interest, and if so, how do you explain that? The other thing is the research in German, and the fact that you have German is obviously an advantage, or, you know, absolutely essential. But I wondered whether, for example, there had been sort of passing trends in the German historiography. I'm thinking particularly of the influence of the Cold War. You know, the sort of material that I've read has either been in translation, or has been people like James Joel or Nettle or so on. And one of the problems isn't that they're necessarily telling lies, but they're tending to see things through Cold War, you know, a Cold War lens. And I'm thinking particularly of Nettle's biography of Luxembourg. I've actually come across some arguments that there are sections of that, particularly on the relation between Luxembourg and Kautsky, and Kautsky's second wife. There are arguments that Nettle is deliberately distorted. So I wondered if, again, whether the sort of power of this from all sides, you know, Daniel Lazare refers to Trotsky's bastardization, but it seems to be much more widespread, and therefore is a problem for those of us who can't read the language directly.
There's also a question in the chat from Marie. I'm just gonna quickly read it out before you come back. Basically, it's a question of how have we lost this great tradition when there is today so much greater need for international solidarity and international cooperation. And all we have is something like the, you know, European Left Party, which is Millerandism, really, isn't it? It's left parties who are trying to be in government. And how could we perhaps reform a true international? I think that was all the questions.
Okay.
I think you can, I'm not sure where Kevin is, but I think I'll just ask you to sum up now.
No worries, that's fine. Thank you, Tina. Okay, so just to bring up my points. Before I deal with the labor aristocracy question and so on, I just should make it clear, I can bring up the slides to prove it. I talk about the Stalinist bastardization of the legacy. However, in a kind of very mixed metaphor, I say, and it's Trotsky's mirror image. So I probably should explain what I mean by that. So, as I alluded to in the talk, under Stalin, and it's not just Stalinism, but under Stalin, and to a certain extent before that with the Lenin cult. But let's leave the Lenin cult to one side for now. But basically, under Stalin himself, and this has been shown by a guy called David Brandenburger, who's gone away and literally looked at all the edits Stalin made to his book, the notorious book, The Short Course on Party History of the Bolshevik Party. And he's gone, what becomes evident from that is that Stalin himself, he takes a draft written by party historians that have gone away and researched the history of the Bolshevik Party. and he literally line by line, any positive reference to German social democracy, any positive reference to Karl Kautsky, and any positive reference to Bolshevism as a European or an international phenomenon, not just a kind of Russian experience, Russian radical experience, is kind of excised or changed or modified, and it's quite interesting to see that. So it's literally from the Stalinist bastardization perspective, it is that rewriting of party history to make it more Russian nationalist or socialist in one country, if you like, which is a huge distortion of the history in order to create a party of a new type, so-called, which is free of factionalism, etc., etc. And one of the ways Stalin and Stalinists tried to do that is to say, well, yeah, there was the Second International, but because it had factions, because it had different competing views within it, etc., it fell for opportunism. The Russian Bolsheviks were never like that. We never had faction, etc., etc. So it's kind of that's the one hand of it. The mirror image in the kind of slightly mixed metaphor is simply that whether consciously or unconsciously, for a long time, many Trotskyist comrades have been saying pretty much exactly the same thing. I did have a picture of Joseph Seymour's Lenin and the Vanguard Party. That's a particularly, how would you put it, pronounced take the Trotskyist interpretation, which basically, unbeknownst to Seymour at the time, obviously, because this stuff has only really come out now properly, is that is essentially making the same arguments that Stalin does on the party history. I think to anyone who thinks in that way, it should ring. If you're a Trotskyist and you're basically echoing Stalin, that should ring some pretty strong alarm bells. So that's what I meant by that, Dan. I hope that clears that up. But I do think that the left has, and this relates to Marie's question, which I'll maybe come back to towards the end. It's inherited defeat, it's inherited failure, and it's inherited a whole load of pretty questionable history. On the labor aristocracy, clearly that's one of the things that's a very important and indeed central factor in the development of the labor movement at that time, as you say, a period of growth and expansion. But it's clearly more than that, because the so-called labor aristocracy as well. You've also some of the more militant, the better paid workers, the ones who had better organization, etc., also formed some of the more militant layers. What I think you see, the way I explain it, is that gradually, through the very success of an organization like the SPD, there is a kind of integration of particularly in the trade unions, but across the party, of those who think, well, actually now we basically run this society, and why don't we just draw the conclusions of that and take over the existing state, and why do we want to go down the road of a revolution? But so the material factor is clearly very important, but I do think that the best way of understanding the material gains made by the German working class, for example, but also in Europe generally, is not solely through because of the gains of imperialism in that sense, but it's actually the fact that there's such a strong, well-organized movement that can assert its power in all sorts of ways, has proper solidarity, etc., etc., etc. So I think that's the other side of it that I would emphasize. Recently in a forum we discussed Zinoviev's Social Roots of Opportunism, which again is worth, I haven't read that for a while, but that's worth going looking back at as well. He's writing that in Switzerland and saying, well, look, how did the party end up where it did? Mainly in my work, I look at I suppose the development of ideas or revolutionary ideas on a kind of ideational or ideal level in the party. And what I look at is yes, how the developments by which the revolutionary content of the organization is gradually perhaps watered down through concessions, unnecessary concessions, oftentimes to the right wing. And I think Kautsky does bear some responsibility for that. And again, I'm writing something on that at the moment on republicanism, which I will complete hopefully as soon as possible. And on the how do we get here, and the blame on the Bolsheviks, I think you know, there's two levels, and I think we've discussed this before. I think if you're a Bolshevik activist and you're looking, you know, in the early 1920s or even, you know, mid and late 1920s, and you're looking at the Second International and what it became, I mean, it's interesting to note that the Second International does still exist. It's not dead. I think it's called I can't remember what it's called. I think it's just purely the Socialist International. And you know, it includes, or until recently, included all sorts of dodgy organizations that have nothing to do with socialism. I'm thinking of the Egyptian Dictators Party. Apologies, comments, I've forgotten, but that was affiliated to the International. So clearly, if you're looking at if you're a Russian revolutionary in the 1920s, then clearly, you know, you're fighting a horrible organization and you want to win people from it. And there is quite understandably the tendency then to exaggerate and all the rest of it, and maybe the history is forgotten. But one of the things I always, exactly, there's a good example from Tony. The Israeli Labour Party was affiliated to the Socialist International, so you know, that's where it ends up, and that's already well in motion in the 1920s. So there's that element to it which I think shouldn't be forgotten. But for me, looking at someone like Lenin, who went through, you know, most of his time was spent in Western Europe. He sat on the ISB for some time. He followed its debates closely. You know, he would always look back and say, you know, look at the positive stuff that came out of the Second International. Look at its resolution. Ditto Rosa Luxembourg. She calls it a stinking corpse. This is a stinking corpse of an organization, but it's but at the same time, look at the Basel resolution. That was fantastic. In terms of the talking shop, I think the talking shop idea. So Annie was saying that the communist women dismissed the experience of the International Socialist Women's Congress and organizations as a talking shop. I'm not saying that's untrue. I'm saying we have to put a very big question mark next to it, because again, you know, International Women's Day, the establishment thereof is not exactly, in terms of action terms, not you know, insubstantial, is it? It's a huge achievement. But I'm saying that, and I completely agree with you on this, and hopefully there will be more work done on Die Gleichheit. I'm looking into it a bit more. You know, we actually need to go away and look at this slightly more and see what was good and what was bad and what was contradictory and all the rest of it. So I think that, you know, it's a very important point to make, because of different factors that have conspired together in history during the 20th century. We know so very little, and that includes me. You're quite open, you know, quite honestly. I can read the German, I can look at the stuff. I've looked at this stuff in various ways for quite a long time now, but it's still, there is so much material that is lost on us, and I think that should you know, a wake-up call. Which I suppose, just on you said, and Gleichheit after 1914, it was established 1891, and it continued into the 20s, I think till 24, and it was replaced, or no, 21, I think, and it was replaced by another publication. But the key thing, and this is where you're absolutely right about Clara Zetkin, one of the most underestimated people in many ways, you know, without trying to kind of draw silly conclusions and silly parallels. In many ways, she's more significant than Rosa Luxemburg. Maybe not on a theoretical level, but in terms of what she did, what she achieved. At the start, she basically single-handedly wrote Die Gleichheit, as far as I understand it. And the magazine really takes a turn for the worse in 1917, when she is kicked out as editor by the SPD party leadership, because she's basically turned it into a factional organ against the party leadership, right? And so the Die Gleichheit, clearly work needs to be done there. There's some stuff in German, but you know, it's there's a lot more to be done. Kevin, on USA and England, I think so. There clearly has been, however small, and we are talking very small, we're not talking 1889 type levels of interest. There has been a small revival in the Second International Marxism, etc. I think in the English-speaking world, I think partly, overwhelmingly, because of a guy I'd referenced at the end, Lars Lee's Lenin Rediscovered, which is a fantastic book, and has had a huge impact, I think, on people today, looking around, looking at their own history, and looking at the left as currently constituted, and trying to at least pose some questions about that. So I've noticed, for example, to my pleasant surprise, that certainly in America and in English-speaking countries, there's obviously quite a few people now can read most people read English at some level, but certainly in the USA, there's been a very welcome, again, very modest, but very welcome upturn in interest in this stuff, and included in my own work, which is really nice to see. I won't overstate its importance, but I do think it is something that is happening, and it clearly points to something that people identify with, because I think they want to see precisely, as I think Pauline said at the start, and Marie asked in a question, how do we go from that huge where socialism isn't just a well-meaning, well-intentioned minority movement of good, hard-working people, but it actually starts to affect the lives of pretty much everyone in society will have heard or have some interaction with the socialist movement. And that's so I think on that level that also explains the interest, right? In America, the debates about the Democratic Party, the possibility of a workers' party, a lot of comrades are saying, well, okay, let's look at this. Let's have a look at Kautsky again. Kautsky is read a lot in America at the moment from the American left, and that's a good thing. On the historiography, yeah, I generally agree. I think there's some really good stuff. I recommended a lot of books in the slides that are good, like James Joel's History is a decent overview. It's not particularly detailed. It's standard anti-Marxist stuff, so you have to read it with a pinch of salt, but it's decent. He's gone away and looked at the stuff. He even spoke, I think, to some of the participants as well that were still alive at the time, so he's gone away and done his research. But yeah, it's part of the Cold War narrative on Marxism is alien to a functioning and healthy workers movement. It just leads to disaster, either in Russia or in opposition in the SPD without coming to power, etc. So that's the overwhelming problem with a lot of this stuff. Of course, it contains really good insights. Stalinist historiography, GDR historiography. Actually, if you peel away a lot of the ideological crap, it does. These people have gone away and looked at the material, but always read with a pinch of salt. Just finally, and just on trends in the historiography of German, I think that in the 70s, in particular, labor history, as I say, has kind of died a death. But in the 70s and 80s, there were also some very good PhD studies and things like that looked at local SPD party organizations in some detail, right? The kind of social history turn. And I think that that is also quite useful stuff, regardless of the ideological point of departure with it. And just finally on Marie's question, how do we get here from where we did? I mean, it's basically through a lot of death and a lot of suffering, right? I mean, and a lot of defeat. Whether it was in Russia or in Western Europe, or the 20th century was a huge, crushing political and organizational and ideological defeat, often sold as a victory, for the working class movement, internationally. And I think that really is where it explains fundamentally where we are today. It's a decline in the organizational forms of the left. It's a decline in the political education of the left. It's a decline in labor history, labor intellectuals, etc. So there's all sorts of factors at play. But I do think that, at least having a look at this material, trying to understand the history of revolutionary Marxism, not as something that begins in 1917 or in 1903 with the purported split between Bolshevism and Menshevism, etc., but actually takes it in the round and looks at this lost history, is a kind of very good way of. It's a good place to start. That's all I would say. But yeah, fundamentally, these are defeats of of enormous proportions for our class, and hopefully starting to understand our past a bit more closely helps us to proceed further in this century with hopefully with more success. That'll do. Thank you, comrades.
Well, thank you, Ben. That was a really good talk. I enjoyed it and learned a lot. Other than to reiterate the plug for Ben's Marxism Translated, I'd also recommend his forthcoming book on Kautsky, which I'm sure comrades would learn a lot from.
It's out.
Good. Well, excellent.
Santa bring it for Christmas.
Good. Well, even better. Thank you. One thing also that I'd just pick up from Ben's last comment is about the importance of history. And that leads us into next week's final roundtable session, when I'm going to invite some speakers from the past few weeks, and Ben, I hope, will be one of them, to discuss this question about what we've learned and really the importance of understanding our history. So it's a sort of way of summing up the whole section, around about 700 years worth of revolutionary history, from the peasant movements in the Middle Ages through the English Revolution, the French, the American, the revolutionary movements that developed in the 19th century, really the whole suite. But perhaps more importantly, trying to get a bit of a discussion going about what we've learned and its application for today. So I'm inviting some people who've already taken part in the discussions to join a bit of a panel, but I hope that all the comrades who are on this call will also join in, so it will have you know, perhaps a good sort of collective feel. Anyway, just before we wind up, I'd like to thank Ben again. I'd like to thank all the questions, and go on to Ben's website if you would like some further information. I know one comrade asked for Ben's final reading list slide, and we'll try and put that up on our usual reading list sections on the LLA pages. And just one last reminder, we've got a new series starting in the new year on Marxism, and then a little later after that, probably in February or March, we'll be starting our next sort of long history strand on revolution and counter-revolution in the 20th century. That's in preparation. So although it looks as if the lockdown may come to an end next year at some point, the LLA education sessions, which have been sort of have really been brought into existence by this lockdown, are going to continue. And I hope they're going to go from strength to strength. Thanks very much, Ben. Thanks very much, comrades. And I'll see you again next week for the last session and roundtable. Okay, so thanks very much.
Bye, comrades. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.